So stereotyping is the process of identifying someone as being a member of a group and then making inferences about them based on what you already know about the group. Stereotype is sort of what those inferences are. So beliefs that we have about members of a group, that people from group X are lazy or friendly or whatever. Prejudices are how we feel about members of a group. Discrimination is how we behave towards them. You know, why people stereotype others and why we have prejudices and stereotypes and the like is a really complex issue, and there are a lot of different approaches people have taken towards them, all of which have some amount of validity. So for example, sometimes we stereotype others in order to simplify. The world is complex, it's full of information, it's very dynamic, changing all the time. It's really too much information for our little brains to process at any single time, and so we stereotype others. If I see you as a young woman, as opposed to who you actually are as an individual, well, I know something about young women, and so I can start interacting with you just on the basis of those generalizations. It makes it easier. I don't have to get to know you fully before I know how to start interacting with you. So one reason why we stereotype others is to simplify. One reason we have prejudices against others is to make ourselves feel good about ourselves. So for example, just like you can feel good about yourself as an individual when you can compare yourself favorably to them, we may be able to feel good about ourselves as members of groups by trashing other groups, by denigrating them in certain kind of ways, therefore making our own group seem more favorable by comparison. Sometimes we have prejudices and stereotypes towards others just to get along with members of our own group, right? So if members of our own group believe things about other groups and feel things towards other groups, I can be a better member of my group and be accepted by them to the extent that I sort of go along with what those stereotypes and prejudices are. My approach to understanding stereotypes and stereotyping and prejudice and discrimination is a little bit different. I take an evolutionary approach. An evolutionary approach to prejudice and stereotyping entertains the possibility that by holding prejudices towards certain groups, by stereotyping individuals, we were better able to survive and pass our genes down into subsequent generations. An evolutionary approach to prejudice focuses on the particular threats and opportunities that individuals might pose. That is, by looking at you, can I identify to some extent, maybe because you're a young woman, maybe because you're an old man, maybe because you're a young member from another group, can I make a reasonable enough guess, just a guess, that you might be a potentially good mate, or that you might potentially be someone who's dangerous, or that you might potentially be someone with whom I can exchange resources. And so from an evolutionary perspective, stereotyping is all about picking up on little cues, simple cues that anyone can see, like gender, like race, and using those cues to make inferences about the threats and opportunities that people might pose, and to do so quickly. So unlike the other view, which says stereotyping is about simplifying, in some sense, stereotyping is about simplifying, yes, but simplifying in an attempt to gain some accurate information reasonably quick. From an evolutionary perspective, prejudices are about the emotional reactions and thus the behaviors that are driven by those emotional reactions that we have towards people who we perceive as posing different kinds of threats. So people who are physically formidable, people who potentially might be dangerous to us, well, we experience a particular kind of emotion. We experience fear when we encounter such individuals. Well, if we think about around the world, if we think about certain kind of prejudices, they really are fear prejudiced. And those fear prejudices really are directed towards members of outgroups, and particularly young outgroup men. We can think about other kind of threats. You can think about threats of disease, right? That would have been very important across our evolutionary history. Well, how do you know if someone is diseased? It turns out that cues of physical abnormality, people whose faces aren't symmetrical, people who walk in funny ways, whose bodies are a little bit malformed, who have funny skin conditions on their faces. Ancestrally, these kind of conditions would have been associated with transmittable disease, with pathogens, and so our evolved mind looks at these things and say, this person is potentially a contaminant who can threaten me. Well, how do you respond to contaminants? Well, we respond with disgust. Disgust leads us to sort of avoid such individuals. And so we have disgust prejudices towards people who are physically different, and even to people who have values that are different because these values are seen as contaminating our groups. You can think about other kinds of prejudices based on the extent to which people treat you unfairly or take more than their fair share. When people do that, we feel anger. And so we have anger prejudices towards groups. So for example, in a lot of countries, there are anger prejudices towards people who are on welfare, people who don't do their fair share, who don't contribute as much as they take. So an evolutionary perspective says that we stereotype other folks in order to quickly get some good enough information, certainly imperfect information, but good enough information that then drives our emotional reactions, which then drive how it is we interact with them, such that we can avoid physical danger, we can avoid disease, we can stop people from taking things from us, and the like. So what would happen if we couldn't stereotype? It's really an impossible question because every critter stereotypes. You can't look at somebody without having some information about them become available to you. There's just too much information. If you had to treat every individual, or if any little rodent had to treat every possible other individual as if it were a totally neutral animal, we would be eaten by owls. If we were the rat, we would potentially be confronted with lots of dangers. There is no such thing as not stereotyping. Now, at least at an initial sort of automatic stage. Now, there is such a thing as not sticking with your stereotypes when you're making judgments about people when you have time to consider alternatives. But the very initial process of stereotyping is inevitable, which means that certain emotional reactions that result from that stereotyping are inevitable as well as these inclinations to behave in one way or another. It doesn't mean that we're actually going to behave in those ways. It doesn't mean we're actually going to discriminate, but it means that there's sort of a first step, an inclination towards discriminating based on the stereotypes that come to mind, based on how we categorize someone based on their age and their ethnicity and their sex and their bodily demeanor and the like. Stereotyping is a totally natural process, as are prejudices. Having prejudices is a natural process. Having a particular prejudice towards a certain group isn't necessarily a natural process, right? Those can be manufactured in a different kind of way. But having prejudices, having inclinations to discriminate, and certainly stereotyping and having stereotypes is a perfectly natural process. So you might ask if whether the naturalness of stereotyping and prejudice makes it acceptable. What I'm talking about here, and what we do in science, is that we focus on the is's, right? What actually happens? What causes what? That something is, right? That stereotyping and prejudice is natural doesn't mean that it's good. It doesn't mean that it's something we ought to value. The is's are different than the oughts. And what drives our oughts are broader sets of values we may have that might come from various other sorts. There may be some circumstances where we think that stereotyping is a good thing, right? My guess is the very initial automatic stereotyping we do is probably, in the big scheme, a good thing. Sticking with those stereotypes and not going beyond them may often be a very bad thing, but this depends on what your This depends on what your values are. A lot of people might think that certain prejudices are a good thing based on their values, but they may not like it when people are prejudiced against their group based on their other values. So there's a big distinction to be made between the is's, what actually drives stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, right, or evolutionary history and other kind of factors, versus ought, whether that's a good thing. And I'll leave that up to people's values to decide, what kinds of prejudices, if any, are a good thing.